Hello there, and welcome back to the Casual Fridays podcast. My name is Art Burns, and I'm here to talk to you about bringing mindfulness into the workplace and how, not only how do we do that, but what happens when we do bring mindfulness into the workplace. Because mindfulness is the very simple skill of, being present and doing so without judgment, and to hold things in a non-judging, accepting, and even curious awareness that leads to the soft skills of things like kindness and empathy and compassion and self-compassion, and even things like the dreaded forgiveness. And we talk about this, we talk about all these topics, and not only the topics themselves and what the meaning of all this is, but we talk about practices and ways in which we can do what we talk about here on the podcast. And so one thing I wanted to start out by saying is when we take these practices and we apply these practices into our workplace, it doesn't stay at the workplace. What happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. Okay. The traits and the skills that we build through these practices at work wind up coming home with us. And they help us to, relate differently with our family, with our loved ones, with our moment to moment experience outside of work. And it should be noted that the same happens in the other direction. Yeah. The more we can practice, mindfulness and all the different practices that we talk about here at home, the more we bring those into the workplace. And so it becomes a very sort of congruous and continuous sort of feedback loop, if you will, that ultimately strengthens the process more and more with every single experience. And this is where it's also very important to recognize that, we talk practice, because mindfulness, as we've talked about here before, mindfulness is not just a concept that we can understand. It's not something to be learned with just our cognition, but rather it is a practice, something that we build a skill through a set of practices, which is no different from, learning to play guitar or learning to ride a bike or learning a new language, for instance. And so we must do the practices in order to cultivate these skills. They don't happen without that. Now, but here's the thing. A lot of times when I say this, it starts feeling like, well, does that mean that I have to practice for my whole life? And this is a really important concept and something I want to be very, very clear about here. First of all, the simple answer is no, not at all. But at the same time, the more complex answer is no and yes. Okay? Because what happens is, as we cultivate these skills, as we do the practices, not even, let's talk about cultivating the skills in a second, but as we engage in the practices moment by moment, whatever those practices might be, no matter which ones we're talking about, right? Any of these practices, what we do in the practice is we attain a state of being. And with mindfulness practices, including the practices of kindness and compassion and empathy, and including the really special practice I'm going to talk about today, what we're doing is we're really cultivating a sense of presence or an ability to be present, and to do so without judgment, and to do so with a sense of kindness and care for the experience that we're having and for ourselves and for everyone else that's involved with the experience. Now, as we do this practice and as we cultivate this state of presence and non-judging awareness and kindness towards ourselves and others over and over and over again, what then happens, and I'm going to use the word eventually because it is the eventual aspect or the eventual conclusion of the process, but it's not like it takes a long, long time. I mean, we're talking about in a matter of weeks, the state becomes the trait, which is to say that we start doing these practices without actually doing the practices, right? We're not intentionally and consciously, doing something, but yet we're doing the practices, right? And this is coming back to the idea of riding a bike, right? It's the classic, right? It's just like riding a bike. You never forget how to ride a bike. So you learned how to ride a bike for the first time, and then you became someone who knows how to ride a bike. And that's a skill that, for whatever reason, it never leaves us. Now, that doesn't mean that maybe the first time you get on a bike, it feels a little wobbly for a second, and maybe it takes a little more energy and it's a little harder on you and your muscles get sore and stuff like that. But it's not like it's a foreign concept anymore, right? And so then the question becomes, for people who ride a bike regularly, are they practicing riding a bike, or are they just riding the bike? Technically, the answer is both, because they're not thinking about practicing, but every time their foot goes around on that pedal, they're practicing riding a bike. And of course, riding a bike is so simple. It's not like we can notice ourselves getting better at riding a bike. We notice endurance, we notice speed, we notice these kind of things, but we don't notice a qualitative difference of being a better bike rider. But when we're talking about things like attention and non-judging awareness and kindness, these are much, much more complex than riding a bicycle, right? And so these are skills that do become deeper and more powerful and more more skillful with all the practice that we do, even after we've kind of come from that state to the trait. Right? So just being you then is further practicing these skills, which is the magic of this work. It really is. Because again, it feels effortless, but yet in that effortlessness, we are deepening and cultivating and strengthening these skills that we're building that really are skills that then just permeate every single aspect of our lives moment by moment. Are you excited yet? Because this stuff is so exciting. Not in the sense of nerdiness, like you don't have to get excited about, in the same way that I get excited because I'm such a nerd. I love this stuff. I'm actually wearing a Brain t-shirt under my shirt here. I might as well show this here, right? Like I am the nerd of nerds when it comes to this stuff. But I hope you're excited in the sense that this is a reclaiming of something that most of us have lost. Most of us had it when we were kids. Kids, if you watch a kid and their behavior, they're all mindful, right? A 2-year-old child can sit on a sidewalk with a beetle for like 4 hours. Well, not, they'll get hungry, but like for 30 minutes can pass like nothing. Because kids aren't all in their heads about what am I supposed to be doing? What should I be doing? Am I letting something down? Do I have obligations? What should what can I be grinding right now? Right? Kids are just like, there's a beetle. I want to be present with this beetle and explore this beetle. Right? And you all know this. I mean, even from remembering ourselves from long, long, long ago, we can imagine ourselves in those situations, And certainly if you're a parent like I am, you've lived through this and you've watched your child do this. And so I say that to illustrate that most of us have been this. Most of us have had these skills at some point in our lives. And so they're not something that's brand new to us. It's something that we're returning to. It's something we're reclaiming. It's something that we're awakening within us. And this is important because that's the way the body responds to it, right? Because we are wired. That's why we're like that when we're children. We're wired to be like that. We're wired to be curious. We're wired to be, open in our awareness. We're wired to be kind to one another. We're wired to be, present and have compassion for ourselves and others. And we know this through neuroscientific research that shows that when we're in a place of well-being, this is what's present. As Dan Siegel says, integration of the brain made visible is kindness and compassion. So when you are in your optimal state, kindness and compassion are flowing like endlessly, like you have an effortless and endless supply of it. This is an important thing to understand because if we think about, what we go through at work, are we always feeling kind and compassionate at work? And so the absence of kindness and compassion often does, indicate, most of the time indicates an absence of integration, a lack of integration. And when we are in a disintegrated place, well, that's when we experience stress. And that's when we're likely to feel, resistance towards the things that are happening, and judging them and saying, no, 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 that's no good. I can't accept this. Or we're likely to attach ourselves to the things that we believe we're supposed to be. Right? Like getting back to the idea of a beetle on the ground. I mean, none of us as adults would take 20 minutes to sit here and just check out this beetle like we did when we were 2. Make some mud pies while we're at it, right? But yet, and the reason why we don't do that, the reason why that's not something available to us is mostly because of that story in our mind, that there's something that we're supposed to be doing. Right? That's why the cliche of, stop and smell the roses, right? None of us stop and smell the roses. That's why that's such a cliche, because we all need to hear that from time to time. And so these practices are enabling us to get back to that sense of presence and that sense of, again, openness and curiosity and acceptance and a willingness to be caring and kind. And when we can bring this into the workplace, integration of the brain, if you have a group of people who are all working with integrated brains, then the group itself is going to become more integrated within the organization of the workplace. Now, integration, very quickly, there's something very important to understand about integration, the way it's, the way we're talking about it here, which is, again, really the basis of the brain, right? The integration within the brain includes differentiation and linkage. So that's not to say that one part of the brain becomes, less strong or less pronounced in order to allow the other parts to sort of express themselves. It's quite the opposite. Every part of our brain becomes stronger and more differentiated in its role and in its power and its ability, and then they link together and work in harmony with one another, in balance. That's what integration is. And you can see how that would apply to a workplace for sure, right? Like, you don't want your account executives to be less of something so that your salespeople can be more of something, or vice versa, right? Everything can be its own powerful and distinct source of resource. But then, if we're all acting in this, or if we're all cultivating this internal and this individualized integration, well, then the various parts of our organization, again, are going to integrate more deeply and more harmoniously and more powerfully. And the end result of this is something, as Dan Siegel would describe this. He says that an integrated system is greater than the sum of its parts. Now, everyone who's a manager out there, just your bells are ringing in your mind right now, right? Because that's what we want. In the workplace, we want the system, the complex system, the organization of our workplace. That's exactly what we're looking for, is a culture and an integration that's going to make it greater than the sum of its parts. And so I want to introduce you to a practice of mindfulness that is purely based on communication. Okay, now, as we know, when we're at work, when in any kind of whatever work we do, right, there's almost always some component to it that involves communicating with other people. Is that fair to say? Can we say, not every single thing, sure but even like the software developers, even the people who are, or the IT people working overnight who are just talking to servers all night, right? There are times where this person's going to have to communicate with a coworker or with a manager or with a customer. And of course, those are the, I'm naming one example of an outlier, right? Most of us would concede that within the rank and file member of an organization of any kind of business, whether it's nonprofit, for-profit, governmental, charity, whatever it is, or like spiritual, like religious, like even the workings of a church, that there's going to be a lot of communication with each other. There's going to be a lot of need for cooperation, right? That we're both operating towards a common goal. And so when we can bring the attitudes and the energy of mindfulness, which is to say the attitudes and the energies of being present without judgment, accepting and seeing things really clearly, both internally and interpersonally, right? Externally with the relational sense of myself with all these other people, then that's how we create this strength of an organization that not only picks up for each other, not only helps to, sort of buoy each other, because it does, but it becomes something that's really just so powerful that it's, again, greater than the sum of its parts. And what happens then on an organizational level is that when one member of the organization leaves, the organization is so strong that whatever new person comes into it, it becomes a seamless and integrative process to acclimate them in, or to integrate them in. Yeah. So the power of this is nearly beyond description, even though I'm using a lot of words to describe it. So anyway, the practice that I want to talk about with you today is the practice of active listening. Now, I did an episode of active listening. It was, I think, probably in the first 50 episodes of the Showing Up to Life podcast, and it remains to this day the most listened to podcast I've ever done. Okay, so this is good news. This is beautiful to hear. It's beautiful for me to tell you, because this means that people recognize the power and the importance of active listening. And maybe what that means is that people recognize that active listening is not the default for most people. Most of us, in any given circumstance, we are listening not to understand what the other person is saying, but instead we're listening to respond to what the other person is saying. Which in practice, in the effect of the conversation, what that usually means is that I'm just waiting for you to pause for a second so I can jump in and give my expression of my idea, right? Now, most of us make do with this. Most of us carry on, and certainly with, modes of communication like email and things of this nature, it's easy for us to really, okay, this is everything I need to say. I'm not getting interrupted by somebody, who's looking to say what they're saying, right? But that doesn't mean that, again, there are meetings that we have. There are, one-on-one conversations that we have, even in the elevator, right? Where this is all contributing to moving the organization forward. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. You can't answer me, so I just hope that makes sense. So when we can cultivate this skillfulness among everybody at work of active listening, just imagine what that does to the day-by-day, moment-by-moment operations of a workplace. I mean, it's almost, you got to sit for a minute and really imagine how harmonious things can be. Now, again, it's important to recognize that this is operating on both an individual level, right? Because as we're practicing, so if we're doing this sort of default thing where we're really just listening for the other person to stop talking for a second so we can express ourselves so that we look smart or whatever, right? That's a form of, that's getting us to a place of stress eventually. That is a form of distraction. That is a form of not being present. And that is, as Sharon Salzberg says, who's another great teacher and psychologist and mindfulness practitioner and teacher and writer, she says that distraction exhausts, but attention energizes. Which is to say that moment by moment, as we're trying to, outsmart ourselves in a conversation, we're taking up so much energy and time. And so that's leading to a feeling of, I don't want to bother. I'm too tired for this. I'm burnt out here. So we can look at this as an opportunity that every single conversation that we have in the workplace is an opportunity to come into the present moment and to focus our attention to the here and the now. And the more we do that, again, we cultivate integration within our brains, because attention training promotes integration. And so when we're training ourselves to pay attention to what the other person is saying, we're promoting integration within our own brains. And then that integration is going to be on a group level as well. As Dan Siegel calls the integration of relationships, we become a fruit salad as opposed to a smoothie, which is really cool. So how do we do this? It's such a simple practice and so easy and really powerful. So I'm gonna give this to you, and again, you can do this at work. You can also do this at home. You could do it informally, or you could do it formally. Now I'm going to tell you about the formal way to practice it first, and then we'll tell you how you can adapt this to be a more informal practice that you can just do when nobody really knows what you're doing. Okay, all right. So this requires at least one other person. Right now, you can do it with a group of people, and that gets pretty cool. We call this an active listening circle, right? But I'm going to give you the instructions first of how to do it just one-on-one. And if anybody wants me to help you translate that into a circular process, just email me at art@artburnscoaching.com, and I will give you the instructions for that. Fair enough? Okay. So you and a trusted partner, family member, friend, coworker, whoever, okay, are going to do this practice. Now, you're going to need maybe about 10 minutes to do the practice properly. You can do more. You can sit there for an hour if you want, but block out at least 10 to 15 minutes to do the practice so that you feel like you have enough time. You're not rushing through it, okay? So basically, again, you have person A and person B. Right? Now, the only other thing you're going to need is a timer. And everybody has a smartphone now, and there's a timer on every single smartphone, okay? But eventually, again, just like the state to trait thing, eventually you don't need the timer. Just for the first, few times that you do it, though, get a timer so that you can really be clear about the amount of time that everybody's taking to speak, okay? This will make sense in a second. So now, person A goes first, let's say. Now, it doesn't matter who goes first in the actual process, but I'm just saying person A in my little scenario is going to be the first person to speak, which means that person B is the listener, okay? Now, I suggest a 3-minute window, but don't start with 3 minutes. Start with 1 minute, all right? And see how that feels, and then, maybe do one back and forth with 1 minute, another back and forth with 2 minutes, and then another back and forth with 3 minutes, right? That would equal 6, 10, that'd be almost like 14 minutes or something like that you're going to spend, okay? So what you're going to do is this. You're going to have person A gets to speak. So first set the timer for whatever time is comfortable. If you're just starting out, just do a minute, but if you've been doing it for a while, do 3 minutes. Start the timer. At that point, person A gets to speak whatever they want to speak about. There's no rules to what they're allowed to speak with and speak about. And in fact, if they run out of something to say, they are allowed to just sit there quietly until something comes up, which is a great practice in and of itself, right? Because a lot of times we feel like we need to fill the void with our words, but we don't. We can sit there quietly and allow the conversation to arise. Allow the thoughts to arise. We don't need to rush ourselves. So person A has the floor. They have the conch shell, as the Lord of the Flies would call it, right? And they are allowed to, again, speak of anything they want, including speaking about nothing. Now, person B's responsibility in this first round is to listen. Now, the rules for person B are very specific. You are not allowed to reply. You are not allowed to even comment on what the person is saying, because every time you comment on something, if you say, oh, wow, that's interesting, well, then the person who's speaking is automatically going to change their conversation to go more in the way of that interesting thing, because that feels really good that you just said something I said was interesting. So now I'm going to try to make it more interesting rather than being authentic with what I want to say. Okay. So you're not to comment, you're not to respond, you're not to ask questions. The only thing you can do, and which is suggested to do, is to, nod your head and that kind of stuff. Just to let the person know that you're still there. You don't want to just sit there with like a deadpan, unaffected look on your face that they don't even know if you're listening or not, right? You want to make sure they know that you're here with them. So whatever that means, body language, nodding, that kind of stuff, right? So now the other thing that person B is doing, which I hope is obvious, is they are listening. Right? They're not thinking about other stuff in the background. They are listening to what person A is saying to them. Okay? Now, we do this for 1 to 3 minutes, and then the timer sounds. When the timer sounds, person A now is done speaking, and person B then does what we call reflecting back to the person. Okay, which is to say, we're going to reflect back what we just heard for the last 2 or 3 minutes. But this is not a memory exercise. This is not, the point of this is not to remember word by word every single detail that the person said and just repeat it back like a parrot. The purpose of this is to let this person know that we heard them. They matter so much that we listened enough that we understand them. Okay, and that's different, right? Because there's a trick, like with salespeople will tell you, is that just repeat the last 3 words that the person says, and that lets them know that you're listening to them. Well, that's a gimmick, right? So what we're doing here is we're trying to cultivate a skill, right? And so this skill is about understanding. And so you're going to, so let's say person A said, I talk about my vacation last week, and then I talked about the upcoming school year and how stressed I am over it. And then I talked about this thing that happened at work with a project that didn't go so well. And then I talk about this other thing that I did, right? And so person B says, well, I heard you say this. I heard you talk about the vacation. I heard you talk about the thing from work, and I heard you talk about that last thing. That's only 3 out of the 4, right? So it's not about memorizing and repeating back. But now the person A says, well, yeah, you really heard me on items 1, 3, and 4. But then there was this other thing that I said about, the upcoming school year that I'm really stressed about. And now you're speaking it again. And now person B says, oh, yeah, that's right. You said that and this and this and this and this. Now, once you feel satisfied that everybody heard everything, now you close this sort of round by saying, thank you, I feel heard. Once this point has happened, and not before, right? Like you're allowed to go back and forth as long as it takes. Okay, because the point is it's not about getting it right. It's not about showing, oh, what a great active listener I am. I got a good score, right? It's about making sure that we're getting it. So if it requires going back and forth 5, 6 times before person A really truly feels heard, well, that's what it takes, and that's okay. Okay, so don't rush it. And it is very important for person A to make sure that they feel heard before you go on. Because active listening is, like many of the other practices that we do here, for instance, like attention training. When we're training our attention, what we're also training is understanding when our attention has wandered. And so practicing active listening is also about practicing expressing ourselves, which is an art form or a certain skill in and of itself, and a very important skill in and of itself. How many times have you left a conversation and said, I wish I had said that, and why didn't I say that? Oh man, I left that out. right? So this is also a practice for person A in the ability to just, rest in the moment and make sure that they're taking the time to say what they truly wish to say, because it matters what you have to say. All right? So now once that happens, and not before, but once person A feels heard, they tell person B that they feel heard, and now you switch sides. And so now person B is the speaker, person A is the listener. Set the timer, same rules apply. Person B is allowed to speak about whatever they want to speak about, including nothing. They can respond to what person A just talked about, or they can talk about something completely different, or they can do both, right? And person A now is the listener, and their job is to not interrupt, not sway the conversation through any suggestive language or anything like that, and to just listen to understand, to hold that space for this person, to let them express themselves. And in a real way, as we cultivate some kindness around this, is think about the kindness involved with letting someone feel felt or making someone feel felt. That is a very beautiful and generous thing that we can do. Generosity, by the way, I don't know if you remember me saying this, but generosity is a core skill in and of itself. Richard Davidson, who's another neuroscientist, neurobiologist who I follow a lot and talk about a lot, and taking courses and read a whole bunch of stuff and everything. He says that the most effective way to activate the circuits of the brain associated with positive emotions is through generosity. So if you can bring this sense of generosity, that I am giving this person my attention and my openness, and holding this space for them to say whatever it is that they want to say, it has nothing to do with me. I'm allowing for this other human being, this fellow traveler human being, to express themselves. And that is coming from a place of generosity and giving. My friends, this is very, very powerful, very powerful. And now, again, this is something we can do all the time. So what I would suggest is find somebody to do this practice with at least once a day for 15 minutes, like maybe right after lunch or something like that. Or, maybe right after the end of the day, before you go home, you spend 15, 20 minutes together. Do this practice, okay? Try to do it every day for like 2 weeks, right? Monday through Friday. And then notice how you find yourself sort of automatically being more engaged and being more patient with people and allowing this space for people to express themselves. You're going to be amazed at how much it changes, how quickly. Now, again, though, I said that we can also practice this informally. The person doesn't have to know you're doing it. Right? You can just allow somebody to speak and really be paying attention to what they're saying. And then when there's a natural pause in the conversation, instead of jumping in with your idea and your, opinion or whatever it is, you can use that pause to say, I hear you saying this. Am I right? My friends, if you start doing that to the people at work, you are going to be the person that everyone wants to meet with. When you pop up on someone's calendar, they're going to be like, yes, I love talking to this person because they make me feel felt. Now, they're not necessarily going to consciously know that, but they're going to be drawn to you. Now, again, for all you managers out there, imagine if everybody in the organization is doing this. Imagine if every single meeting was like everybody was excited for meetings. We don't see meetings as a drag and a chore, right? I think I've mentioned here, I've definitely mentioned it on my other podcast many times, that going to the grocery store for me now is like, there's no hassle to that at all. I love going to the grocery store, because it's an opportunity for me to connect with people like this. And it makes me feel, benefited and well when I do that. And why? Because attention promotes integration. Integration promotes kindness and compassion. And it's important to remember or to recognize, and I don't know if I mentioned this before, but this is a circular process. And I asked Dan Siegel this in a class that I took with him one-on-one in a video call. I asked him, I said, if integration made visible is kindness and compassion, which is to say that as we cultivate integration, it produces kindness and compassion, then is it not also true, Dr. Siegel, and he always says, call me Dan, that if I practice kindness and compassion, do I not also promote integration? And he said that was the most important question of the call. I was so proud of myself. This is like 800 people, most of them like PhD students, right? And it's not an ego thing. Maybe it's a little bit of an ego thing, but it just felt really good to have that affirmation. It made me feel felt when he said that, how important that was. But anyway, then he went on to say, the really important thing is that he went on to say, it has nothing to do with me, but the important thing is that he went on to say that this is the way we have to start looking at things, as circular, not one direction or another direction. That what produces something or the product of something is also the cause of something. And this is where stuff gets really, really fascinating when you can start seeing it that way, right? Which again, as I said before, right, while I'm training my attention, I am also training the ability to know when my attention has wandered. And so when I notice my attention wandering, it is a practice of attention training. It is both the cause and the effect. That's so cool, isn't it? Anyway, I've said enough here. I hope you all enjoyed this episode today. I do have written instructions, and I'm happy to share them with you. And when I share them with you, I hope that you share them with everybody else you know. Okay, so if you want these written instructions, all you got to do is email me, okay? art@artburnscoaching.com. I answer every email that comes into that address. So please, even if you're not looking for the practices, if you have a question, if you just want to say something, if you want to tell me I'm nuts, I'm wrong, whatever, you know, challenge something here, you want to praise something here, you want to criticize something here, I am open to all of it. Every single communication I get from any of you helps me to understand myself and to understand how I'm teaching things. Okay, so it is an act of generosity for you to spend a couple of minutes sending me an email. You could look at it that way. All right? All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this. Happy Friday to you all. If you're listening on Friday, I know it's already almost 6 o'clock on the Mountain Time, so it's like 8 p.m. on the Eastern Time. So most of you are already in your weekend. I apologize for being late. I had a lot of meetings today, helping people grow and cultivate these skills. It's time consuming, and so I did the podcast as early as I could, and here it is. All right. So anyway, I wish you well. I'll be back next Friday. I'll be back tomorrow with a Showing Up to Life podcast, where I'm going to be talking about the power of compassion. So you can check that out too. Have a great day, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. I wish you well.